Let the fire steady the hand. Every scar is a lesson. We train until the night itself tires. Focused, determined. The blade will not waver.
Once the valley roared with hooves and war.
The Mongols had never lost a war, not once, not in 40 years. They had crushed China, they had erased Persia, they had turned the greatest city on earth into a graveyard. And on September 3rd, 1260, every single one of them in that valley died. They weren't killed by a great empire. They weren't stopped by some legendary kingdom with centuries of military tradition. They were annihilated by an army of former slaves, men who had been kidnapped as children, sold in open-air markets like livestock, and forged into living weapons. Men who had never known a mother's voice or a father's hand. Men whose only family was the soldier sleeping next to them in the barracks. This isn't Hollywood. This actually happened, and almost nobody knows the real story of how it went down. Before we get into this, if you enjoy learning about the ugly, forgotten truths of history, the stories your textbooks were too afraid to tell, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. To understand why September 3rd, 1260 was a miracle, you need to understand the thing that was coming. You need to understand the Mongol war machine. And I need you to forget everything you think you know. Movies, video games, internet memes, they've turned the Mongols into a cartoon. A screaming barbarian horde. A chaotic swarm of horsemen. Think of every Mongol you've ever seen in a game like Civilization or Age of Empires. Savage, disorganized, primitive. That is a lie. A dangerous lie. The Mongol army was, in reality, the most sophisticated, disciplined, and technologically integrated military force the medieval world had ever produced. If the Pentagon existed in 1250, they would have studied these people. The Mongols were the Special Operations Command of the ancient world, except they operated at the scale of entire continents. It began with the horse. A Mongol child learned to ride before he could walk. By 5, he could fire a bow from the saddle. By his teens, he could sleep while his horse marched. The horse wasn't an animal to a Mongol warrior. It was his legs, his supply chain, his escape pod, and his life. Now, the Mongol horse was ugly. It was small. A shaggy pony, barely 14 hands high. A European knight would have laughed at it. But that pony was the Tesla Cybertruck of the ancient world. It wasn't pretty, but it was indestructible. These animals evolved on the Mongolian steppe, where temperatures cratered to -40. They dug through snow to find grass. They marched for days without water. And here's the part that broke every army that faced them. Every single Mongol warrior rode into battle with a string of 3, 4, sometimes 5 spare horses. Think about what that means for a second. A European knight rides one massive war horse. He rides it hard all day. The horse is exhausted. The army stops. The whole campaign grinds to a halt because the horses need rest. The Mongol warrior rode one horse until it tired, swung onto the second, then the third. He never stopped. His army covered 60, 80, sometimes 100 miles in a single day. They moved faster than news could travel. An enemy king would get word that the Mongols were a week away, and the next morning they were at his gates. That's not an army. That's a blitzkrieg, decades before anyone had a word for it. But the horses were just the platform. The real weapon was the bow. The Mongol composite bow was an engineering masterpiece that makes a modern compound bow look like a toy. It was layered from horn, wood, and sinew, bonded with fish glue that took months to cure, like a carbon fiber layup, but done by hand in a tent on the steppe. It was short enough to fire from horseback, but it packed a draw weight over 100 pounds. It could punch an armor-piercing arrow clean through a knight's chainmail at ranges most medieval soldiers couldn't even see clearly. And the Mongols didn't just shoot. They coordinated. Their organizational structure was a decimal system, the same mathematical logic that runs your computer. 10 men to a squad, 10 squads to a company, 10 companies to a regiment, 10 regiments to a tumen, a division of 10,000 men. They communicated with flags by day, lanterns by night. They could execute complex battlefield maneuvers in total silence, wheeling, splitting, encircling, with the synchronized precision of a murmuration of starlings. It looked like magic. And their signature move? The feigned retreat. Simple, devastating, repeatable. They would charge the enemy, rain down arrows, and then run. They'd scatter, throw down weapons, act panicked, terrified. And every single time, the enemy commander would see the feared Mongols breaking and scream the same thing. "We have them! Charge!" The enemy army would break formation. The knights would gallop ahead of the infantry. The line would stretch, disorganize, gaps opening everywhere, and then a flag would wave, a horn would sound, The fleeing Mongols would wheel their horses around. Fresh units, hidden behind hills or in tree lines, would slam into the enemy's flanks. The pursuers would suddenly find themselves surrounded. The trap would snap shut like a bear trap. For 50 years, this one trick destroyed everything. The armies of China, the Shah of Khwarezm's empire, the knights of Russia, Poland, and Hungary. It worked every single time because commanders kept making the same mistake. They assumed the Mongols were panicking. They weren't. It was a system, an algorithm of death. By the 1250s, the Mongols turned their eyes toward the Middle East. They were led by Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis. Hulagu wasn't just a conqueror, he was an exterminator. His orders from the Great Khan were simple: destroy anyone who resists, enslave anyone who surrenders. In 1258, he arrived at Baghdad. We need to pause here, because what happened to Baghdad is one of the greatest tragedies in human history, and most people have no idea. Baghdad in 1258 was the Silicon Valley, the London, the New York of the entire world, combined into one city. It was the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. 1 million people lived there. The House of Wisdom held centuries of accumulated human knowledge: mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy. Scholars there had preserved and advanced Greek learning while Europe was fumbling through the Dark Ages. Al-Khwarizmi, the man whose name literally gave us the word algorithm, did his work in Baghdad. The Caliph, Al-Mustasim, believed the walls would hold. He believed the Muslim world would rise up to defend the heart of Islam. Hulagu didn't care about beliefs. He brought Chinese siege engineers, the SpaceX engineers of medieval warfare. They built trebuchets that could hurl boulders the size of cars. They launched jars of burning naphtha, essentially medieval napalm, over the walls. Baghdad fell in weeks. What followed is hard to process. The Mongols weren't just conquering, they were punishing. They massacred the population. Estimates range from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million dead. They burned the mosques and palaces. They destroyed the irrigation canals that had made Iraq fertile for thousands of years, turning the breadbasket of the Middle East into a desert that, some historians argue, has never fully recovered. They threw so many books into the Tigris River that the water ran black with ink for days. Centuries of human knowledge, mathematics, poetry, medical texts, dissolving into the current. And the Caliph? Mongol tradition held that spilling royal blood on the ground brought bad luck. So they rolled him in a carpet and had their horses trample him to death. It was a message broadcast to the entire world. No one is safe. No title, no lineage, no God will protect you. After Baghdad, the juggernaut rolled west. Aleppo fell. Damascus opened its gates in terror. By 1260, the Mongol Empire touched the Mediterranean Sea. They had reached the edge of the Asian landmass. Only one power remained standing. Only one obstacle between the Mongols and the conquest of North Africa, and eventually, Europe from the south. That obstacle was Egypt. And ruling Egypt was the most unlikely military force in history, the Mamluks. The word Mamluk means owned. These were slaves, but not slaves in any way you've ever imagined. They were warrior slaves, a weaponized caste. Think of it as the most brutal military academy ever conceived, except the students were kidnapped children. Most of them were born on the Eurasian steppe, the same grasslands that produced the Mongols. They were Turkic peoples, ethnic cousins to the Mongols themselves. They were captured as boys 10-12 years old by slave traders, sold in the markets of Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad. The buyers were sultans who wanted something specific, loyalty that couldn't be bought because it was built from scratch. Once purchased, a Mamluk boy was converted to Islam, taken into a barracks, and for the next decade, his entire existence was training. Horsemanship until he could ride like a Mongol, archery until he could shoot like a Mongol, sword fighting, lance combat, tactical discipline, hammered in every single day. These boys had no family, no tribe, no country. Their only family was their fellow soldiers. Their only father was the sultan who owned them. Their only home was the barracks. It created a brotherhood so tight it makes the Marine Corps look like a book club. They were professional soldiers in an era of amateur farmers called up for a few weeks of fighting. While European feudal armies relied on untrained peasant levies, the Mamluks trained every single day, year-round. They were the Navy SEALs, the Delta Force of the medieval world, except there were tens of thousands of them. And because they controlled the weapons, and because they were better fighters than the men who owned them, they eventually realized something obvious. They didn't need the sultans. In 1250, 10 years before the Mongols arrived, the Mamluks overthrew their masters. A caste of slave soldiers executed a hostile takeover of one of the richest kingdoms on earth. It was the most improbable regime change in history. like if the Secret Service collectively decided they were running the country now. By 1260, the Sultan of Egypt was Qutuz. He was a hard man for hard times. He'd been a Mamluk himself, risen through the ranks by being smarter, tougher, and more ruthless than everyone around him. He knew what was coming. Baghdad was gone. Syria was gone. And then the letter arrived. Hulagu Khan sent envoys to Cairo carrying a message that is famous in history for its sheer, terrifying arrogance. Listen to these words. From the King of Kings, of the East and West, the great Khan, to Qutuz the Mamluk who fled to escape our swords. You have heard how we have conquered a vast empire and purified the earth of disorders that tainted it. We have massacred all the people. You cannot escape the terror of our armies. Where can you flee? What road will you use to escape us? Our horses are swift, our arrows sharp, our swords like thunderbolts, our hearts as hard as the mountains. Fortresses will not detain us, nor armies stop us. Your prayers to God will not avail against us. Hasten your reply before the fire of war is kindled. Imagine receiving that email. Imagine the silence in the throne room as those words are read aloud. Qutuz's advisors were terrified. They wanted to pay tribute, negotiate, surrender gracefully. They said, "Look at Baghdad, look at the skulls stacked in pyramids. We cannot fight them." But Qutuz understood something fundamental about bullies. Negotiating with the Mongols was just dying on a longer timeline. Submission was slavery. Resistance was death. Or freedom. He made his choice. He arrested the Mongol envoys. Then he did something that broke every rule of diplomacy in the medieval world. He had them cut in half at the waist. He took their heads and mounted them on the gates of Cairo. There was no going back. He had looked the apocalypse in the eye and spit in its face. But Qutuz wasn't suicidal. He was calculating. He needed a general who could match the Mongols in cunning, someone who knew the terrain, someone as dangerous as the Mongols themselves. He needed Baybars. Baybars was a towering figure, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, a Kipchak Turk from the steppe. He had a cataract in one eye that gave him a look that would make a UFC fighter take a step back. He was brilliant, ambitious, and utterly ruthless. He and Qutuz were rivals, natural enemies in the knife fight world of Mamluk politics. But Qutuz summoned Baybars and said something that could have come from a war movie. "We can kill each other later. Right now, if we don't work together, we're all dead." Baybars agreed. He was appointed commander of the vanguard. And then, a miracle, the kind of luck that changes the trajectory of civilizations. Far away in Mongolia, the great Khan Möngke died. Mongol law required all princes to return to the capital to elect a successor. Hulagu Khan, poised in Syria with over 100,000 men, got the news. He had to go back. He couldn't take his whole army. The logistics of moving 100,000 soldiers back across Asia were impossible, but he couldn't leave his conquests undefended. So Hulagu made a decision that would change history. He took the bulk of his army east and left behind a rearguard of 10 to 20,000 troops under his best general, a man named Kitbuka. Kitbuka was a Naiman Turk, a Nestorian Christian actually. He was a veteran, loyal, and supremely confident he had 20,000 Mongols. In his mind, that was enough to conquer Africa. He didn't think he needed the main army to handle a bunch of Egyptian slaves. That arrogance would kill him. In Cairo, Qutuz and Baybars received the intelligence. The main Mongol host was gone. The pressure had lifted. They had a window, narrow, fragile, but real. Qutuz addressed his army. He told them, "We will not wait for them to come to us. We will go to them." This was unheard of. The standard response to Mongols was to hide behind walls and pray. But Qutuz knew walls wouldn't hold. Not against Chinese siege engineers, not against naphtha and trebuchets. He ordered the army to march out of Egypt, across the Sinai Desert, and into Palestine. He was taking the fight to the enemy. And here's where the story takes one of its strangest turns. The Mamluk army had to march through Crusader territory. The Holy Land was still dotted with Christian kingdoms, the remnants of the Crusades. These Crusaders hated the Mamluks. They had been fighting them for generations. But when the Mamluks arrived, near the Crusader city of Acre, something extraordinary happened. The Crusaders looked east at the Mongols, who had already raided their lands, and then looked at the Mamluk army marching to stop them. In a rare moment of realpolitik, the Crusaders let the Muslim army pass. They even sold them supplies. The Christians stepped aside and let the Muslims march north to save civilization. Geopolitics makes for strange bedfellows. Now, Baybars led the army into the Galilee, hunting Kitbuka, and this is where the battle was won. Not on the battlefield, but in the dirt. To understand why the Mongols lost, you have to look at the ground. You have to think about grass, about horseshoes, about heat. The Mongol war machine ran on grass. Those strings of ponies needed massive pasture. A Mongol army was like a swarm of locusts. It ate the land bare. Syria and Palestine in late summer? Dry, thin grazing. The Mongol horses were hungry and weakening. The terrain was rocky limestone. Mongol ponies were unshod. No iron horseshoes. Their hooves were tough, but sharp Levantine rocks chipped and cracked them. The Mamluk horses were shod. They could gallop across that ground without injury. And then there was the heat. September in the Jezreel Valley. Brutal sun. The Mongols, in heavy silk and leather armor designed for the steppe, were cooking. The Mamluks were desert acclimated. Logistics win wars. Always have. Amazon didn't beat Sears because they had better products. They beat them because they had better logistics. The Mamluks didn't have a better army than the Mongols. They had better logistics for this specific ground, at this specific moment. Baibars chose the battlefield with surgical precision. He chose the Jezreel Valley, a place called Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath, biblical terrain where David had supposedly faced the giant. The valley is roughly triangular, bounded by the Mount Gilboa range to the south and the Galilean hills to the north. It was a funnel, and Baibars was about to turn it into a kill box. His plan was audacious. He was going to use the Mongols' own favorite trick against them, the feigned retreat. Baibars would take a small vanguard, a few thousand men, and ride into the valley floor, make noise, be visible, look like the entire Mamluk army. Meanwhile, the main force, tens of thousands of fresh cavalry under Sultan Qutuz, would hide in the hills and forests on both sides of the valley, silent, invisible. Baibars would engage the Mongols, fight, and then run, drag Kitbuka's army deep into the funnel, past the hidden positions, and then the trap would close. It was insanely risky. If Baibars broke too early, the Mongols would run his men down. If the hidden army was spotted, they'd be slaughtered piecemeal. If Kitbuka didn't take the bait, the entire plan collapsed. On the night of September 2nd, the Mamluks took their positions in the darkness. They silenced their horses. They waited. The sun rose on September 3rd, 1260. Kitbuka arrived. He saw Baibar's small force on the valley floor. To him, it looked like a foolish vanguard he could easily crush. He didn't scout the hills. He didn't send reconnaissance into the tree lines. He was a Mongol general, undefeated, invincible. He ordered the charge. The ground shook. 10,000 Mongol heavy cavalry thundered across the valley. Baibars held. He waited until the last possible second. Then his men charged to meet them. For hours, Baibars fought the most dangerous holding action in military history. Charge, strike, wheel, retreat. Charge again. Make it look real. Make it look like you're trying to win, and failing. His men fought like wolves, biting and running. Baibars was everywhere, a demon in the saddle, shouting orders, rallying his men, keeping the performance alive. And then, he gave the signal. The Mamluk vanguard turned and fled. It looked like a rout. They were running south toward the narrow end of the valley. Kitbuka saw the enemy breaking. The bloodlust took over. After them, don't let them escape. The entire Mongol army spurred forward. They broke formation, stretched into a long, disorganized column chasing the fleeing Egyptians. They rode past the silent hills, past the hidden trees, straight into the mouth of the trap. When the Mongols were deep in the valley, Baibars stopped. He turned his horse around, and from the hills, the drums began. The sound must have been apocalyptic. Thousands of drums, cymbals, and trumpets erupted from the hillsides simultaneously, like surround sound in a valley of death. Then the banners rose. Green and yellow Mamluk banners appeared from the tree lines on both sides. Qutuz led the charge. Tens of thousands of fresh cavalry poured down the slopes like an avalanche. Kitbuka realized, in one horrible moment, what had happened. He was surrounded, outnumbered, caught on broken ground. His own army's favorite trick had just been used against him. But the Mongols were the best soldiers on earth, for a reason. They didn't panic. Not yet. Kitbuka wheeled his formation. The Mongols fought with the ferocity of cornered predators, firing volleys of arrows that blackened the sky. The battle collapsed into a chaotic melee, horse against horse, sword against sword. The dust was so thick men choked on it. And at one point, the Mongol left flank smashed into the Mamluk lines with such force that the Egyptian formation began to crumble. The Mamluks wavered. The old terror crept in. These were the Mongols, the eaters of the world, the undefeatable. Sultan Qutuz saw his line bending. He saw the fear in his soldiers' eyes. And he did something that belongs in a movie. He threw off his helmet. He wanted his men to see his face. He wanted them to know their sultan was right there, in the blood and the dust, with them. He charged into the thickest part of the fighting, screaming at the top of his lungs. It worked. The Mamluks, seeing their ruler risking his life beside them, rallied. They surged forward, and then came the surprise. The Mamluks had brought something the Mongols had never encountered: primitive hand cannons. Tubes packed with gunpowder and gravel, mounted on poles. They were crude. They barely did physical damage, but the noise, the crack and roar of exploding gunpowder, terrified the Mongol horses. These ponies, raised on the silent steppe, had never heard anything like it. They bucked, reared, threw their riders. The Mongol formation shattered. It was possibly the first time gunpowder was used in a pitched field battle in the Middle East, a preview of the future, arriving just in time to change the present. The trap closed tighter and tighter. Kitbuka fought on. His horse was killed beneath him. He kept fighting on foot. He was offered surrender. He refused. He was finally dragged, battered, and bloody before Sultan Kutuz. The exchange between the two men is one of history's most chilling moments. Kutuz looked at the captured general. "You have shed so much blood, ended the lives of so many heroes. Now you have fallen into the trap yourself." Kitbuka, even in chains, was defiant. He stared back. "If you kill me, do not think you have won. When the news of my death reaches Hulagu Khan, the ocean of his wrath will boil over. From Azerbaijan to the gates of Egypt, the land will shake with the hooves of Mongol horses. I have served my master faithfully. You murdered yours." It was a surgical insult. Kitbuka was reminding Kutuz that the Mamluks were slave soldiers who had overthrown their own sultans, traitors, usurpers. Even facing execution, he twisted the knife. Kutuz ordered him beheaded. The remaining Mongols fled, but there was nowhere to go. Local villagers who had suffered years of Mongol raids hunted down the stragglers in the hills. By sunset, the valley of Ain Jalut was silent save for the groans of the dying. The invincible army lay dead in the dust. The myth of Mongol invincibility, the idea that had paralyzed the entire world for 40 years, was shattered in a single afternoon. News spread across the Islamic world like wildfire. The Mongols can be beaten. Damascus rose up and threw out its Mongol garrison. Aleppo's Mongol governors fled. The Mamluks marched into Syria, not as conquerors. They reunited Egypt and Syria into a powerful state that would endure for another 250 years. But this is where we need to talk about the dark epilogue, because history doesn't do clean endings. Remember Baibars, the general who designed the trap? The man who spent hours baiting the Mongols, putting his life on the line in the most dangerous role of the entire battle? He expected a reward. He wanted to be made governor of Aleppo. He felt, with some justification, that he had won the battle. Kutuz refused. He didn't trust Baibar's ambition. He feared the man he had unleashed. On the march back to Cairo, while the army was hunting hares in the desert, a group of conspirators surrounded the Sultan. Baibars approached Kutuz, reaching out as if to kiss his hand, a traditional gesture of respect. It was a signal. Baibars drew a dagger and plunged it into Kutuz's chest. The savior of the Middle East, the man who had spit in the face of the apocalypse, was dead, murdered by his own general less than 2 months after saving civilization. Baibars rode back to Cairo and declared himself Sultan. And, credit where it's due, he became a great one. He solidified the Mamluk state, built mosques and schools, fought off the Crusaders, and created a diplomatic network that rivaled anything in Europe. But his reign began with the blood of his brother-in-arms drying on his hands. The Mongols did try to come back. Hulagu wanted revenge, but he got distracted. The Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in human history, began eating itself. The Golden Horde in Russia, who had converted to Islam, declared war on Hulagu for destroying Baghdad. The Mongols ended up fighting each other. The wave had broken. So what did Ain Jalut actually mean? If the Mongols had won that day, the dominoes would have fallen across the globe. Egypt falls. The Mongols sweep across North Africa. They reach the Atlantic. They potentially invade Europe from the south, crossing the Strait of Gibraltar. Mecca and Medina, the holiest cities in Islam, might have been destroyed. Islam as a major civilizational force might have been broken. One battle, one valley, one afternoon set a limit. It proved the Mongols were human. It taught the world that terrain matters, that knowing your enemy matters, that the underdog, with the right plan, the right ground, and enough courage, can break any empire. Today, if you go to the Jezreel Valley, it's quiet farmland. Tractors work the soil where arrows once flew. But the story of what happened there on September 3, 1260, still carries a message that echoes through every century since. No empire is forever. No force is truly unstoppable. And history is not written by the overwhelming odds. It is written by the people who refuse to surrender to them.